Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi and welcome back to a special guest episode of That Trippi Show. This week we welcome a guest I've been excited to have on for quite a while, author and journalist Tim Alberta, who's been covering the MAGA movement longer than just about anyone. What I'm excited to talk about is his perspective on where the GOP is today and where it's going to go. His first book, American Carnage, looks at the rise of Trump as an evolution of the GOP, a symptom of radicalization and polarization. Now he's got a new book out. It's just a must read. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. I'm really looking forward to talking about both of these in our discussion today. Tim, welcome.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Alex, where do you want to get started?
Well, before we get to the book, Tim, I have to ask about your personal fall from grace, as it were. I know you're a baseball fan. We were talking a little bit about pre-show, and I think you at one point had dreams to be a baseball writer. I thought that was going to be my job too, and then I fell into politics. I'm curious how you went from like what sounds like the best job ever to writing books on MAGA. Like, I want to know really where I went wrong by asking you this question, but like, how'd you get into this?
Yeah, man, there are days where I really do envision what life might have looked like had I found my way into sports writing. And, like right now, I'd be getting ready to go down to Florida to watch pitchers and catchers reporting as opposed to trekking around the early primary states. Although I guess in this case, there's really not much trekking around to do because there's really not a primary on either side. But yeah, my only real interest in journalism from the time I was pretty young, like probably middle school age, was just in reading the sports page every day growing up and just being sort of enamored with this idea of wow, like people get paid to go to games and just tell their readers what happened at the games. Like what kind of a dream job is that? And so that I was a little bit aimless as a youth, but that was really the North Star of sorts for me. But when I got to Michigan State, I took sort of a winding path to get there, went to community college and had to figure some things out in my life. But by the time I got to Michigan State, I looked around and realized that like half the kids there wanted to be sports writers. Half the kids in the journalism school, anyway, wanted to be sports writers. And a lot of them were smarter than I was, more ambitious, more experienced. And, I started to feel a little bit discouraged. And frankly, I kind of reached a place, I think my second year there at Michigan State, where I was thinking to myself that I'd probably just throw in the towel and maybe I'd look at marketing or PR or something like that. And then by sort of a chance encounter, I learned about this program down the road in Lansing covering the Capitol as an internship and reporting for a wire service there, a small wire service. And I took that and ran with it, and one thing led to another, and here I am. And it was just sort of a happy accident and a lot of lucky breaks along the way. But really, I really did start to view politics as an even more important game, if you will. I mean, there are some similarities to sports writing, as you guys know, and covering politics. Obviously, the stakes are so much higher, and there's just there are serious consequences to this game that you're covering, and I found myself really drawn to it, even though I didn't grow up political, didn't know much at all about this stuff before I was sort of thrust into it. I found myself really kind of falling in love with it, and and now a little bit less so, I suppose, given all that we've had to endure here in recent years.
That's probably true for all of us. I mean, I started out, crazed to be in politics, and now it's just not fun. It's really, I do it now because I got to. I mean, I have to help stop Trump. I can't. Otherwise, I'd try to walk away. But talking about the stakes, I really like you to, if you could, to go talk us through, from American Carnage and the evolution of the GOP to where we are now. Briefly an overview of where, how that's where you saw it starting and where and how we got to today.
Yeah, Joe, it's interesting. When I moved to Washington, it was the twilight of George W. Bush's presidency. And most of the reporters who I knew were all kind of tripping over each other, lining up to cover Barack Obama and the Democratic Party for understandable reasons, right? I mean, this was really a moment in our national life, and for the foreseeable future, the Democratic Party was ascendant and in control. And yet, at that same moment, for whatever reason, I just really found myself drawn to covering the Republican Party and examining how this institution was sort of collapsing in real time, and between Bush's popularity cratering and McCain's campaign unraveling, and Sarah Palin sort of putting forth this blueprint of anger and grievance and anti-intellectualism, and kind of signaling that the party might be going in this very new and different direction. It was just, for me, a moment in time that I was totally fascinated by. And so, in covering the party in the aftermath of Bush's presidency, into the Tea Party years, into the pre-Trump years, and then obviously sort of, this populist backlash against Obama, against big government, against demographic changes in the country, against the cultural shifts happening, underneath the feet of conservatives everywhere. Ultimately that culminates in Trump. And for me, you could sort of draw a pretty straight line between a lot of the economic and cultural and racial and political anxieties of, '08 to Trump's election in 2016. There's a pretty linear path that you could chart between those events, and really, knowing what we know now, Trump's ascent actually makes a lot of sense, right? As crazy as that might sound, it actually really does seem to be like a logical conclusion to a lot of those events over the previous decade.
So you trace it back, and I seem to recall you writing about how there was essentially a war within the party after Bush's loss, right, between basically the absolutists who are like the Ted Cruz's, Jim Jordan's, et cetera, and I think you call them the pragmatists with like Boehner and Ryan. Two of those people are still very active in Congress, and two of them are out of the party. Like, obviously, it's very clear the absolutist won. But at that moment, was there, and this is bringing it more towards your new book now, was there that kind of tie towards the kind of radical evangelicals yet, or was that still kind of nascent? Like, how did those kind of fuse?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, in my experience covering the religious right in those years, they were sort of, I would say, I guess on one hand, you could say that they were sort of split between those two camps, between the sort of grassroots populist, movement types, and then the more kind of establishment types. But they were also, I would say, more than being on both sides or more than being torn, I would say that they were almost sort of neutral. Like you certainly did have, I think, at the grass tops level, you had some of the organizational leaders who would align themselves with the Tea Party, even though they were longtime Bush people and they had lots of ties to kind of party leadership. But I wouldn't say that you were necessarily seeing the evangelical movement playing nearly the role that it is today in terms of being like at the tip of the spear in in um, in kind of mobilizing behind candidates and behind causes. I mean, certainly around certain issues such as the abortion issue, you would see a lot of evangelical energy, but it was more, I would say, during, at least during those earlier years, kind of coming out of the Bush presidency, it was more around some of those policies, a little bit less around some of the personalities. Now that obviously began to change, and you saw people like Ted Cruz, for example, who was really able to tap into some of that evangelical support. And it's easy to forget now, but like when in 14 and 15, when Cruz was beginning to build out his campaign, which was a really sophisticated operation, they really made evangelicals kind of their linchpin. I mean, they launched his campaign at Liberty University. All of their early work on the ground, the field work in Iowa was all built around turning out evangelicals, identifying evangelicals. So they were really onto something. And of course, it's also easy to forget now that evangelical voters were sort of the bane of Trump's existence in 2016 for quite some time. I mean, every primary, every caucus was the same story. Trump was getting trounced among evangelicals, but was running up huge margins among non-evangelicals, and that was eventually how he wore out Cruz and Rubio and Kasich and the rest of the field. Um, and obviously, without getting ahead of the conversation here, obviously that began to change, but it's really just worth emphasizing because it feels like history is moving so fast around us every day now that Trump had this huge hurdle to get over in 2016, where much of the evangelical grassroots and much of the evangelical organized leadership at kind of the national high profile level were really highly suspicious of him and were mobilizing against him throughout that primary. And it took some pretty extraordinary measures on his part, on Trump's part, to be able to bring those folks back into the fold in the fall of 2016.
I mean, how does he do that? I mean, like in the New York Times headline for the review of your book, your new book, was, and this could be the title of the show, How American Evangelism Became Mr. Rogers with a Blowtorch. That's a quote from a preacher that you talked to. I really like that line. But I mean, are they tied in the same thing? How did evangelism, itself radicalize? And was Trump part of that was him, bringing them to his side? Was that part of that radicalization? Did he accelerate it, or how do you think about that?
So yeah, there are a few different things going on simultaneously. Even before Trump comes along, you have this grievance, this resentment, this sense of being under siege and losing their country and America's values, America's Judeo-Christian heritage kind of slipping away. And that is a long-running theme, right? I mean, I step back in chapter 3 of the book and take readers way back to the 1960s and 1970s to examine the groundwork being laid for all of this with Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority to help understand holistically the arc of the story here and the path that many of these folks were set on before they maybe even knew that they were set on it, right? So I think certainly during the Obama years, but even before that, but even more so during the Obama years, there's a sense that the country is becoming unrecognizable. And like, is there a racial, demographic, xenophobic component to that? Yeah, obviously, of course. I think there's also a huge cultural component to it. Like Obama runs for president in '08, opposed to same-sex marriage. And by the time he leaves office, same-sex marriage is the law of the land, right? To take one example. So there's no question that you have a real sort of sea change culturally happening in the country. Fewer and fewer people are identifying as Christians, as churchgoers. We're seeing a kind of historic change up in terms of the composition of the country and what its core values are and are not. And so there's this kind of moral panic setting in among many in the evangelical world. And Trump at first is almost like emblematic of the backsliding, right? They see the thrice married casino owning, grab them by the what vulgar Manhattan billionaire. And they're like, well, this guy is exactly part of the problem. I mean, that was really a big part of like Cruz's campaign in 2016. Like this guy he's a charlatan. He's a heretic. You can't trust him. But when Trump becomes the nominee, he very effectively convinces, he and his campaign, they convince the masses of evangelicals that basically this is a binary choice between him and Hillary Clinton, and that whereas they know Hillary Clinton will accelerate these trends that a Clinton presidency, appointing pro-choice Supreme Court justices, accelerating what they see as an assault on religious liberty, that they know they're going to get a bad outcome with Hillary Clinton, but if they want to roll the dice on Donald Trump, that he will give them the victories that they want, even though he's not one of them personally. And so he puts Mike Pence on the ticket. He releases the list of Supreme Court nominees. He pledges to put pro-life justices on the court. He talks about the Johnson Amendment and rolling it back and protecting churches from IRS invasion. He sort of deploys, he dog whistles, and he speaks to all of these kind of niche concerns in the evangelical world, and effectively rallies these people around him, even though they think that he himself is sort of antithetical to the Christ-like persona that they are called to pursue. They still choose him as sort of a lesser of two evils option, and that is like the foot in the door that Trump gets in 2016, which now feels like ancient history.
Well, and it kind of almost feels like that foot in the door became kind of kicking it down with how he's kind of doubled, tripled, et cetera, down on a lot of these things. Like, I mean, I just remember one of the things I will always remember about the Trump presidency is him holding that Bible upside down. And that has turned into, I think it was this past week, he's been tweeting a bunch of AI images, or wherever he is, putting a bunch of AI images, him praying in church surrounded by fire, which, by the way, he has 6 fingers on each hand, which I don't know how people didn't catch on that one. But there's this weird contradiction. I mean, I know you just talked about it with Trump, but zooming out a little bit with the MAGA movement and where the GOP was kind of vis-a-vis with evangelicals. I mean, you think about stuff like national debt, but they spend a bunch more money than Democrats do. You talk about compassionate conservatism, but then the same party does the Muslim ban, family separation, all that. Like, it seems like there's kind of this unresolvable question, and we get these questions from our listeners all the time. Like, I just don't quite, it doesn't track to us how Trump has become that, from that like imperfect vessel to now kind of the flag bearer. Like, how far can this thing go?
Well, you might want to pour yourself a stiff cocktail, because the answer to that is not real encouraging. Before I get there, let me step back and address what you said a moment ago. I mean, look, the simplest answer for explaining how this guy of all people comes to sort of co-opt and hijack a movement and remake it in his own image, it comes back to fear. Really, it comes back to a sense that they are the rightful inheritors of this blessed nation, this Judeo-Christian nation, this heritage that they are now seeing stripped away from them in real time, and that if something isn't done, then it will be lost forever. And it's just tough to overstate for me, to anyone listening who's not sort of steeped in this world and the rhetoric and the messaging, that this is not seen anymore as a fight between red and blue, or a fight between conservative and progressive, or Republican and Democrat. It's a fight between good and evil for a lot of these people. And they have assigned these kind of existential, apocalyptic stakes to our partisan disputes now. And so you begin when you're operating in that mindset, you are then able to look at someone like Donald Trump and say, well, God used terribly flawed people in the Bible to advance his interests and to protect the Israelites in the Old Testament. So why is this any different, right? The problem is that you have kind of a merging of, and this is the title of the book, obviously, but you have a merging of two kingdoms into one here. Christians are taught to believe, and they are instructed to live their life in the pursuit of a kingdom that is not of this world, and they are promised that is the kingdom that Jesus offers them, and that if they believe in him, then as an inheritance, a very different sort of inheritance from this one in the American kingdom, that they will receive eternal life. And I think, as I quote a pastor in chapter 1 of the book, actually the pastor who succeeded my father at our home church, he talks about how for far too many American Christians, and there is something very specifically amiss in the American church because of our comforts, because of our sort of entitlements to the privilege and the prestige and the wealth and the security that we've enjoyed in this country that many Christians around the world have not. There is this peculiar way in which American Christians have come to think that fighting for America is fighting for God and vice versa, and that, fighting for one kingdom is the same as fighting for the other. And so in that fight, if you believe that it's good versus evil, then you're willing to make peace with the fact that Donald Trump says these terrible things and that he behaves in ways that are completely alien to the New Testament model, and you can find a way to justify it because desperate times call for desperate measures and the ends justify the means. So to your question about where this goes and how bad it could get, look, I mean, what you see throughout history is that when authoritarian political impulses merge with a religious ends justify the means identitarian fanaticism, you tend to get really bad results. And I'm not bedwetting for the sake of bedwetting here, and I'm not trying to scare anyone. I just think it's like it's reality. You have to appreciate at this point that there is, in certain quarters of the American evangelical movement, a cult-like attachment to Donald Trump, and there's very little that he could do or say to break that bond. And if and when he decides to escalate his rhetoric, escalate his actions, pursue or direct or recommend any sort of conflict, civic conflict, violence against neighbors, violence against the government. We have to be prepared for the reality that many people will be willing to follow him into that. And they will be willing to follow him into that in no small part because of a religious conviction assuring them that this is a fight for what is good, that it is not just a fight for what Donald Trump says, but that Donald Trump is sort of a vessel and an instrument of God in this moment. What I am describing here does not represent a majority of evangelicalism in this country. I don't think it even represents a big, a huge sizable minority. But as we've seen in the sort of institutional hijacking of the Republican Party and in kind of some of the institutional hijacking of evangelicalism, you don't necessarily always need a majority. You need a really well-organized and disciplined minority who can sort of exert their will. And I think the fear is, for me anyway, that unless there is something more done inside of the church to push back on this, the problem is going to get worse.
How do you sort of taking this into today, and sort of the politics of today, when you look at what's happening, Iowa, New Hampshire, where, he's winning, 55% of the vote, Nikki Haley, who knows how long she'll last, but how will the politics of the race, like the longer this fight goes on within the Republican Party, or do you even see one that could help break the evangelical hold that he has away? I mean, would losing if he lost primary after primary? I mean, I'm talking about the practical politics of it right now. I'm not talking about the breaking the fever, which I know Alex wants to get into, but is there any way the politics of today or is there anything Joe Biden could do? I mean, in other words, because that's going to be the focus now for the next, 8-9 months is what's happening politically and how's that, will they feel more threatened and hang on to Trump even more strongly as if he starts to slip in the polls?
It's tough at this point to imagine a scenario where any meaningful mass of these folks abandon Donald Trump. I mean, they've had their opportunities to do so. They've been offered off ramps before. I mean, what makes this moment so amazing and bewildering is that you have people like Mike Lee, for example, the senator from Utah, coming out before the Iowa caucuses and endorsing Trump and saying that it's a binary choice between Trump and Biden. And this is before a single vote is cast in the primary. So, I mean, by definition, it's not a binary choice, and the party has not yet chosen its standard bearer. But all these folks are coming out and saying effectively that they have. And so, that's we've traveled quite a distance, obviously, from the lesser of two evils phenomenon of 2016, and it's really, I think, instructive to see the political apparatus of the Republican Party aligning itself so early and so effortlessly behind Donald Trump. And I think that that is a response to what they see happening, on the ground with their voters. It's not, the listen. Give them credit where it's due, I suppose. I mean, much of the reason that the Republican Party wound up in this position, as I write about a lot in my first book, is that the party leadership was just totally arrogant and tone deaf and disconnected from the concerns of its base, and they paid a huge price for that. And if anything, now the party has become almost overly responsive to its base. There are very few people in party leadership in Washington who are willing to come out and speak uncomfortable truths to these people. And so that is its own kind of evolutionary irony, I suppose, that's brought us to this place.
So I actually kind of want both your perspectives on this, and we probably have time for like one more question. So I want to end slightly positively. And at times in your book, you're actually kind of positive, Tim. So I do want to get there. But one of the questions we ask all the time is like, how and when do you see, and I know, Joe, you mentioned this earlier, how do you see that fever breaking? Joe, I'm curious electorally here first, and then we'll go to Tim. Like, you've consistently maintained we just got to win big. Is that still the best antidote here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in a weird way, what we're talking about kind of makes that possible, because as you're seeing in these results, the evangelical base, as Trump works harder to keep it and to move, and conservative in the party writ large, he continues to heat that up, but at the same time, that's losing moderate Republicans, non-evangelicals, and independents. And so I think what Tim just talked about, why Republican leaders won't break with this is because you can't, if the evangelicals and what's now become the MAGA base don't vote for you, you're gone. But it's not enough to win, there's plenty of districts where that'll be fine and plenty of places where that'll work for you. But the problem is he's starting to bleed, I think, independents, moderates. And so it's sort of grinding down to that base. I'm not sure you need to break away the evangelicals to defeat him. I think we can get to a 55-45 kind of place in the country where he's sort of boiled down his base to the radicalization of his base. But the reality, though, I think what worries me in terms of breaking the fever, because I don't think that'll break it. I think that's where, what Tim said earlier is worrisome, because I don't know that in that defeat, even if you beat Donald Trump 55-45 in a general election, would anybody believe it? Would this group believe it? And what his escalation of rhetoric and the people who believe in him so firmly, would not break the fever. It might make the fever even hotter and more violent. So while politically, I think this is actually helpful in terms of winning the 2024 election, particularly with Speaker and in some of the religious overtones of what the agenda that's starting to get carried by him and Trump, and what Trump has to promise to keep the evangelical base fired up. I think that moves a lot of the country away. Maybe it's the secularization, the same thing that is creating the fear of losing something is those numbers, but I think those numbers work. But Tim, I don't know. How does the fever break? And if so, let's say it's a big win over Trump in November. I don't think you'd agree that would be the break in the break fever. How would this play out?
Boy, yeah. What I've seen, guys, up close, what I've documented in both of these books and in my other reporting, suggests to me that maybe this isn't a fever, that maybe we're just operating now at this hotter temperature, and that
Mhm.
maybe the best case is that we just stay where we're at. That the idea of it breaking and going back to where it was is probably not ever realistic. I hope I'm wrong on that, by the way. I do, but I just think that we are now living in the post 9/11 era, that where we've seen the the essential institutions of our public life be diminished, and confidence eroded in them. We don't trust our leaders. We don't like our neighbors. We don't want to engage in meaningful, persuasive discourse. I'm speaking in generalizations, obviously, but and I think obviously, you have social media and cable news, and these information echo chambers that just pour kerosene on the fire here. And so, listen, I'm not super optimistic, if you can't tell already, about where this goes. And you know, that's not to say that I think that we that we fall into civil war like in the next 5 years or 10 years or something. I don't know that I'd be quite that pessimistic, but I certainly do not hold my breath thinking that any day now there's going to be this come down moment where people who have locked themselves into these increasingly radical and hostile positions, uh, policy positions, rhetorical positions, just kind of, their stance towards the world around them. I don't know that that's going to just like suddenly change, barring, and look, let me proselytize for a minute if I can. Like, I think, the reason that writing this book was so important to me is, I'm a Christian, and I believe to my core that maybe the only thing that can truly transform hearts and minds is a relationship with Jesus, and people can and do transform because of it. We see that throughout history. We see examples of people whose entire worldview and their entire, amazing grace is, once was lost but now I'm found, was blind but now I see. I mean, this happens. It can happen, and I believe in the power of transformation. And so, to the degree that I hold out hope, it is a hope that is found in Scripture, and it's a hope that's found in Jesus, and specific to the radicalizing in the church. Not even thinking about our societal issues more broadly, but just within the church. You diagnose these things, and people say like, well, what's the cure? Well, the cure is Jesus. It's right there in front of you. It's the thing that you come to church for. That's the paradox in all of this. And so I hope that that at the very least in the church, once, I quote Russell Moore somewhere in my book, and he says effectively, he says, when your idols let you down, there's an opportunity to turn back to Christ in those moments. And so I do think that Trump and partisan politics and national identity, I do think that those things have become idols to far too many in the evangelical movement. And my hope is that, you know, when those idols do let them down, as they inevitably will, that there will be at the very least an opportunity in the church for those of us who are called to be brothers and sisters and to treat these folks with humility and kindness and compassion and grace, that we can help them in that moment to recenter their focus on Jesus, and to move away from the extremes that have been so seductive.
Well, I think that's about as good and about as positive as we could probably make any kind of ending. We are just about out of time, guys.
Hey, Tim, thanks for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening to That Trippi Show. Tim, where can our listeners find you and find the book?
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter at Tim Alberta. I have a website that I keep, buytimalberta.com, and that's BY, not buy as in purchase. But if you want to buy, if you want to purchase, you can just go on Amazon or find booksellers near you, and you can look for either of the titles there.
And we'll put links to those in the show notes for you if you're listening and want to find them. Just check the show notes and we'll put them there. This podcast will always be free and support from our advertisers and as part of the Resolute Square. Check out the latest at resolutesquare.com/Trippi. Please subscribe to That Trippi Show and leave a review on Apple or wherever you listen. Spread the word about this special episode and let others tune in. You can always send a question to thattrippishow@gmail.com or leave us a question in the review on iTunes. See you next week, and thanks, Tim, for being on. A great book. I really urge our listeners to go out and both of them are excellent and really give you an understanding of how we got here and maybe how we get out.
Thanks very much, guys. I appreciate it.
Resolute Square.